Welcome to the Tell Me More podcast, where we unpack a little bit of this past weekend sermon and we dive deeper into the material. This weekend, we talked about Revelation 6 through 8, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Hey, how are you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
Yeah, how are
good.
you?
I'm doing pretty good.
Pretty good.
Yeah. So not related at all, but my back hurts. And you know what's so funny? My dog has a really bad habit of jumping up on the counter and just grabbing whatever.
The counter? Like the kitchen counter?
She's a golden doodle. And so she can like fling her whole body like an orca up on a counter and grab things. And so last night she grabbed a fork.
Okay.
And she has a fork sticking out of her mouth. And this is not my most shining moment, but I did like direct my foot towards her face and I got stabbed by a fork.
You went for a high kick? Like a karate thing?
I was like, no. And I just
I'm surprised you went for your mind said foot, not hand. I mean, the hand is right up there.
Yeah.
But the foot's way down low and you have to bring it up so high.
Well, she was coming down and then just fork tongs in my foot.
Oh.
I know. And
like top?
Yeah. Yeah, the top of my foot.
How? No shoes on?
No shoes on.
Shoot, man, that's awful.
I started bleeding all over the kitchen floor.
Oh, gosh.
So
we need to have like a prayer and healing service
I know.
this morning.
You know what? I'm going to be fine.
Yeah?
I'm going to be totally fine.
Wow. Yeah, okay.
My family
Can you run?
was shocked.
You're going to be able to run?
I can run.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll be fine.
Did it go in very deep?
I mean, deep enough for me to bleed.
Well, sure.
Like...
That's not very deep, though.
A good amount that was running off of my foot onto the floor. Oof. Okay, we don't have to talk about this anymore.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, yeah. So what did I say? I'm doing okay.
Yeah, your dog stabbed you with a fork and your back hurts.
She did. Yeah. So it's a morning, but right. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. Okay, good.
This is going to be a lot of fun.
And we'll see.
Well, okay, fun is
always an engaging conversation. Fun is an interesting
it's a
word.
Relative term, I guess,
right.
when we're talking about Revelation 6 through 8.
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciated the way that you opened up this weekend. And I think for people who are listening, because of the nature of the material that we're going to be covering, it would be valuable for us to kind of talk about that again.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you want me to do?
So, well, I think because Revelation 6 through 8, if people are unfamiliar with it,
sure,
it's getting into these seven
seals, that contain judgment.
And then necessarily we start to talk about suffering.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess if you want to know what I was saying this weekend, it's just saying that these are really hard chapters, that they stir up, I would say the two of the biggest objections to Christianity that people have, or maybe when they think about God and their concept of God, two of the biggest, you could call it the theodicies, I guess, which are basically like putting God on trial, so to speak. One would be judgment. Why do you judge like you do? And suffering. Why do you allow it? And I didn't really get into that question this weekend. That's a big question. I'm probably not just Revelation 6 through 8 is not necessarily the like a explanation of that, or even but it does come up when you think about people in Revelation 6 specifically who have been martyred for their faith, and so. Not only why is this happening, but how do we respond to it? How should we as Christ followers approach it? One hand is kind of embrace it fully as a sort of like I'm pleasing God when I'm suffering. God is glorified when I suffer. Or on the other hand, is just sort of acting like suffering serves no purpose. But the New Testament has so much to say about it. That's the interesting thing. I mean, there's just First Peter talks quite a lot about it. James talks quite a lot about it. Paul gets into it in different places depending on the letters. It's hard for me to think that it doesn't. The book of Hebrews, in fact, I didn't talk about this in the service that you were in. In fact, I only read it in one of the services, but the end of chapter 10 is so fascinating because it is the same. So you've got a Bible here. Open that up to Hebrews 10. And see what you find when you get to like the final paragraph. Before there's like a paragraph, and then it'll be like a little. That's it right there. And you'll see basically what they're talking about is you're dealing with. Oh, that's it. Okay, it looks the same. They're dealing with it specifically here. You're dealing with a group of people that had come to faith and were zealous for Christ. And then they started suffering, and after a while, they started to think about going back to Judaism. Seems to be what's going on in the book of Hebrews. And so the writer is encouraging them to stay the course and not to give up. It's this idea of endurance, which I talked a lot about. That's really the idea of suffering is not God likes it when you suffer, but God is pleased when we endure, even when it hurts, when we stay with it and stay with Him. And I think that's what you want in any relationship. When a husband and wife stand in front of an altar, they're making commitments, not just, hey, when we have a lot of money and things are good, I promise to love you, but in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, for better, for worse, I'm committed to you. I think anyone in any relationship wants that. And I think God is pleased when we remain committed to Him, even though we're in kind of the down season. We're in the poor, we're in the sickness, we're in the worse, right? In those parts of life. And so that's what's happening. But so do you remember the question? So I'm probably jumping way ahead. But do you remember the question that they ask? Of course you do. That these martyred souls are asking the Lord, how long? How long until you come and avenge? How long until you make things right? Well, they are told a little while longer, rest a little longer, and then by chapter 8, the Lord does something. Well, you see the same sentiment echoed. So read, I don't know, pick it up in there somewhere where I can if you want me to pick it up. But what do you see there?
Is it, therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward?
Yeah.
For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised for yet a little while.
Yeah, yet a little while. So just wait a little while longer. That's almost like exactly the same thing.
Yeah, and the coming one will come.
And the coming one will come.
And will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith.
Yeah.
And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him.
So if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. So it's basically like I will see through this how committed you really are.
Yeah.
And then it goes into Hebrews 11, and you get all these stories of people who endured. And by the end of Hebrews 11, it talks about people being sawn in half. And there's some positives in there. Don't get me wrong. That was the interesting contrast I was thinking of this weekend, is the contrast of the Old Testament kind of characters of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these three Hebrew young men who are brought before King Nebuchadnezzar, most powerful man in the world, ruler of Babylon, all of this, brings them in because they refuse to bow down and worship the idol that he's created for himself. And it was this big ceremony. They're going to play all these instruments, and everybody's going to bow down to this huge creation that Nebuchadnezzar's made. And these dudes just stand there, which is awesome to think about. So they're brought before Nebuchadnezzar. He's furious with them. He heats up this furnace, threatens to throw them in, to which they say, our God is willing or able, and he will save us. But if not, O king, we still won't bow. Essentially saying, you can kill us, but we would rather keep our allegiance to our God than and let him be king than worship you as king and get the comforts of this life. They treated life in God as more valuable than life in the now.
Yeah, and in many ways more real.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, and so I was having an interesting conversation with a coworker last week who was talking about Revelation 4 and 5 and how what has happened, is happening, will happen. And we got into a little bit of that this past weekend.
Yep.
But he was talking to me about the Son of Man being presented before the Ancient of Days.
Sure,
and
Daniel
when
7.
was that? And he was like, could it have been the resurrection or the ascension and all of that? And it brought some clarity around something Dr. Vlachos said while he was here, that we're not moving up towards eternity, like we're not reaching a
traveling
destination
along beside us right now.
Yeah, but eternity and what we perceive as this present moment are moving. It's like on a razor's edge. And so I think that for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that's the reality that they were living in. And that is ultimately the way that faith and hope are expressed in our context. We're having faith in a present moment for a future confident expectation.
Right.
But at the same time, faith and hope run alongside each other. Anyway, so I just think that's interesting.
Totally. Well, I think that's it. It's faith in a different reality, in that what I'm living in or what I'm experiencing right now is not all there is. Therefore, I won't trade temporary riches for eternal reward. That's the thing, and that's why they're committed. And what's interesting is when you place their story, they're delivered. So you know the story. They're thrown into the fire. They're not burned. There's a fourth man in the fire. But then you think about Stephen, who is a faithful witness, who is martyred, the first Christian martyr. And he's stoned, and yet he dies.
He does die.
He dies. They're delivered, but did anything really, I guess what I'm saying is but both endured to the end. And sometimes that results in deliverance now, and sometimes it doesn't result in deliverance now. And I think, but both are, just because Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were delivered doesn't mean they didn't endure unto death. They did. They were faithful. I think there's a phrase, faithful unto death. I need to look that up. But that's the idea. They're faithful unto death.
Yeah, they really were.
Right.
Yeah.
And this is what I was thinking about, and I got into it in more of the other services because it became even more clear to me as I was teaching it. I'm skipping all over the place without any recap.
No.
But hopefully this will make sense. So when I was talking about, so in Revelation 6, where it talks about the souls under the altar, and basically the connection that I was making that I got from William Barclay, which was great, his commentary, which was so helpful. But the idea that these souls that are under the altar are a reference to Leviticus, where the sacrifice of the Jews would be that they would pour out the blood, which is the life. So in chapter 11 of Leviticus, God says, the life of don't drink the blood, which must have been a common practice. He says the blood is the life, and that life belongs to me. So you think about it. They're pouring the life out before God as a sacrifice. Like when you start to think about that, pouring your life out before God as a sacrifice, like the imagery of all of that is like, oh. I mean, Paul more than once says, I'm being poured out as an offering before God. When I pour my life out, in other words, when I choose to be honest, though it's going to cost me, because I am committed to integrity, because I'm a follower of Jesus, I am in essence pouring my life out to some degree. When I choose less money, but because God is directing me to do something different, or it's going to keep me connected to the church community that I know I'm planted in and meant to remain close to. Like I'm in essence pouring my life out. When I serve, I'm pouring my life out. When I'm giving financially and sacrificially to a point that it hurts, I'm pouring my life out before God. That's the picture that's happening here. And so I don't have to die like literal death for that to become reality. But when I die, the little death of my desires, the little death of my plans for the future, the little death of my perspective or whatever, or the little death of my reputation, I'm pouring out before, I'm enduring in a sense unto death, and God is glorified in that. And I think that's what Christ means when he says, if anyone would find his life, he must be willing to lose it, take up his cross daily, follow me. I think it's a kind of a willful, I think that's what Paul's referring to, the notion of being a living sacrifice.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm pouring myself out before God.
Yeah.
On the regular.
And I think a lot of times we think that we get to decide what that looks like, or what pouring our life out would look like, when there's a possibility that God is calling us to something that's incredibly counterintuitive. And it'll hurt in a different way and a lot deeper, I think, when God is actually calling us to make a sacrifice. It's not going to be anything that kind of boosts our ego.
Right.
In fact, it's going to be something that that calls us to, I don't know, be more like Jesus, and yet at the same time become more like ourselves.
Wow.
In the laying down. So
yeah.
Anyway, I love that.
Yeah.
I love that perspective on endurance and what it looks like to suffer well. What would you say to the person who is asking, like, I don't see how a good God could allow that kind of suffering?
Yeah. That's a really tough question.
It is.
Yeah. I mean, the question of suffering is a hard one. I mean, I think there's different answers for it. I think we live in a really broken world. Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of brokenness in this world, and I think God has chosen, at least for this time, to not deal with it all. I think we're in a place where we're kind of living in the already but not yet. So there's already been some provision made for let's say for life, new life through Christ, but then also Jesus did promise that in this world you will have trouble. And I don't think in fact, in John 17, Jesus prays for us. He's looking into the future, and he says, I pray that you keep them from the world, but I don't pray that you take them out of the world. And so it isn't the removal of suffering, but it's the promise to keep us somehow. And that is what I think is what is on offer for all of God's people, is not that you won't ever go through the worst, but that somehow even in that you can be kept. And you might say, well, how does that happen? Well, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell you exactly how that happens, because I think it's probably different in different situations. But I think the promise is that you're kept. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I don't know.
It is a big question, and we could spend probably a lot of time talking about it, because
a lot of people have.
You mentioned the word theodicy at the beginning, and that is the question that theologians have been asking for centuries. Why does evil exist? And they've been wrestling with this idea: if God is good and God is powerful, then why does evil exist? But in the same, and a lot of people would say, oh, well, that's why I don't follow Jesus anymore, because I can't reconcile all of these things. But in the same way, the person who rejects Jesus or rejects God, they will eventually have to answer that question themselves. They want us to give them the answer when they still need to wrestle with why would they say that evil exists. I was listening to Gary Bashir's, who is my theology, or was my seminary professor, and he was talking about all of this, and talking about how the naturalist has to have an answer too.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you're a materialist and you say, well, there is no God and evil exists just because we do evil things, but then you have to wrestle with the there's no beauty, there is no love, there is none of what we experience is good. If there's no evil, then there's no good either, and that's another really horrible thought.
That is a horrible
there's
thought.
not a I mean, I think at the end of the day, we're choosing the best path available to us. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that Christianity has an answer for every single problem that philosophical problem that one might encounter. I can't
on
tell
this
you why.
side of
Like
heaven.
Exactly. I have confidence that all of that can be answered, and will be, but I don't have those answers. But I think every other position also has its own problems, and actually I think it has more problems, which is why I'm a Christian and not an atheist.
I think it's kind of interesting that we started this conversation a little bit like flip-flopped, talking about suffering, because the answer to the suffering that the world is experiencing now is judgment.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about
Right.
that. It's another thing that makes people really uncomfortable to think about judgment. So as you were getting ready for this weekend, how were you approaching this text and this idea?
That's a great question. How was I? I remember, I did what I always do. Tuesday we had our meeting. Wednesday I went to the coffee shop and just sat and thought and read for quite some time. Read through kind of what so the four riders of the apocalypse are released. If you've heard that term, four
horsemen.
Four horsemen, that's
Yeah.
it, of the apocalypse. This is where that comes from. The first four seals of Revelation 6, and they're broken, and these riders are released. Not just released, but sent out. I think that's part of what makes, particularly, let's call it Western Christians, uncomfortable, is that when God, biblically speaking, seems to be behind things that we would consider evil or dark or bad, death, any of that he has, like the death angel in he's
In
killing all
Exodus.
these kids, the firstborn. Why would you do this?
Yeah,
right?
or even all those plagues in general.
Yeah.
It's like, what's going on here?
Yeah. And so you see that in Revelation 6, and you start to ask that question. You start to wonder, is this justified, or it feels uncomfortable to us? And I can't exactly remember how it occurred to me, or what made me think about it, but I started to turn the question around the other way. Instead of asking, why does God judge, I started asking, why not? Why, in other words, maybe we should, instead of asking, why does God seem so judgy, we should ask, why is he so merciful? Why is he slow to respond? Maybe what we're seeing here is not a God who's quick to release judgment on the world. Maybe what we're looking at is a God who has held back judgment. I guess probably what got me to thinking about it was when I started looking at what the four horsemen represented, which is war, strife, like destructive strife. I like the phrase, the disintegration of human relationships, that relationships between people start to break down, that civility, common decency starts to break down. We got a taste of this in the last few years when kind of societally, we sort of reached like a boiling point in 2020, that feeling of like everybody's mad at everybody and anything I say will be used against me, that sort of feeling. And so it was just, there was all this anger, this seething anger from all kinds of different directions. I'm not pointing that at one group of people. It was just kind of everywhere. People were angry. And you got a little taste of that. And I wondered like what, and even more so, like we're isolated into our homes. And so you have this isolation, this disconnection, this disintegration of human relationships. I wonder what would that look like on a mass, broader, extended type scale. It's tribalism. And we're still living in the middle of a really tribalistic time. And then you have famine and hyperinflation. You have massive wealth gap in there with this famine and hyperinflation. So you've got the poor who can't afford to feed themselves, and the rich who've got all that they need. There's this great, I didn't get into it in the sermon, but it was in the, William Barclay pointed out that there was, during the time of Domitian, which ironically is when John is writing, there was somewhere in Asia, which is where he's writing to, there was a famine. And all the poor people, there was a ship coming into, I suppose, the harbor, and all the poor were excited about it because they thought it was food. and the ship pulls in and it doesn't have any grain or wheat on it. It has a special kind of sand for the gladiator, the Colosseum type, whatever, for the gladiator fights for the pit. And they're rioting and angry so that these rich people can go watch this show.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we're starving, like that kind of thing. So you've got that. And then finally you've got plague that shows up at the end. And of course, we're all familiar with that in the last few years. And so you start to see, like, I guess what I started to see is like, this is a picture of the breakdown of a people, the breakdown of a society, the breakdown of civilization. Like, this is what happens when it all starts to erode. And certainly this has happened before. That's the thing, is like what John's writing about, he's not thinking about America, 2023. He was living reality out in the present.
Yeah.
Like in the present, there were famines. In the present, there were plagues. In the present, there was massive wealth inequality gaps. In the present, there was war. He didn't need to think about the future for that to be a reality. It was happening. What I find myself thinking about is what if those things are what happens when culture, society, humanity starts to break down, but what if they in mass have been staved off? What if rather than this soul sort of, these four horsemen sort of sweeping the planet and wiping everyone out, what if God has been holding back what we deserve? I guess the thought that I'd had was, we've had nuclear weapons for how long and we're still not dead? We still haven't killed ourselves. The button hasn't been pushed so many times. How many times have we been stopped from destroying ourselves? We don't know. Yet we think God is super judgy, and yet maybe he's been more merciful than you could possibly imagine.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of what I wanted to do, was sort of turn that around. And I thought the Miroslav Volf quote, which I don't have in front of me, but was really, I love that quote, and I've heard it many times before, but just that when you've not experienced real evil, the idea of a God who never judges is great to you.
Yeah.
But it's when you've walked through like the horrors of what he'd seen.
Yeah. He mentions suburbia.
Yeah. Only quiet suburban, only in the quiet of a suburban street or something like that. Can you come up with a thesis of a God of a God who does not, I don't know what the right word is, vengeance. No vengeance. A God who doesn't take any vengeance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in many ways, when you see those four horsemen, you recognize that God is really, he's turning people over to like themselves.
Well, that's it. Yeah. So like, and that was the thought it has, like, what if what we're seeing here, war and famine and strife and pandemic and all, like, what if I thought about, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, but I thought about the Dust Bowl again. Because I thought, because when you read about the Dust Bowl, it's the overreach of humanity that creates it. And it's like, what if what we're reading about here is the natural response,
God giving people what they want,
like, or what they've, or the harvest, you could say, of what of the seeds we've sown. It's like, this is, you planted this, like you created this, like the Dust Bowl. When you think about all of what they were doing, and the beginning of it's like the great plow up, and they're just plowing up all this ground and turning it over, and then there comes a drought, and it just ends up like, for I don't even know how long it lasts. I've not got to the second episode, but it was fascinating to me to think this is man-made, an ecological disaster that could have been avoided if not for the hubris of mankind, and yet we think we know what we're doing. And you got to wonder, like, how much of that is still going on? How much of that is humanity's overreach, our desire to get into things that aren't our business to get into, but we push past our borders. We think we're God, and it's going to cost us. And what if what you're reading about in Revelation is just the natural outcome of what happens when, like, it's just like the buildup of consequences. That's what I see them as, is the buildup of consequences that will eventually, it's like someone who's lived their life in a completely selfish way for years and years, and maybe for the first number of years, it serves them in some kind of way, but eventually it's like hell catches up to them.
Yeah.
All that self-centeredness that they've lived by for so long, eventually gets them, and they end up creating their own hell.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking.
Eventually they realize that they're not actually happy.
Yeah.
Even though they've done everything they can to cultivate comfort.
Sure, or pleasure.
It doesn't seem to me that comfort or pleasure is what we need. And but we think we know what we need.
Interesting.
And so when we all move in that direction, it doesn't end well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Reminds me of, I've not read it, but you've mentioned it many times, The Coddling of the American Mind. So in an attempt to keep our children safe or to preserve or protect them, we've actually ended up weakening them. Is essentially, I think, what he's saying in that book to some degree.
Yeah.
From what I've heard from you and others that have read it. In our thoughts about what's right, they end up boomeranging back on us. And we find out, we didn't actually know to begin with.
I find that, oh man. Okay, so if we don't need to if we find ourselves seeking comfort and pleasure, I would say what we actually need is community and purpose.
Which requires sacrifice.
Yeah.
The laying down of pleasure. Hard choices. Absolutely. Remaining committed to someone. You can't. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That was what I was thinking of when you were saying that. As I thought, what's going to feel good is eventually going to come back to bite you.
It really is,
and it does.
Yeah. And I keep and what is the movie with the Wally?
Yeah. Wally.
Yeah. I mean, if that's not
really
just
good at that voice.
Kind of, that was really good.
That was a good impersonation, I know.
Yeah. But yeah, it just makes me think of that movie where the end is like, wait, we're all so comfortable and we're so safe. And we have everything we could possibly need.
And we're not really living.
But what are we living for?
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Interesting.
It's like we intuitively know it's not a good idea.
Yeah. But that ain't stopping us from pursuing it, is it?
Yeah, no,
That's
not
wild.
at all.
I mean, you can put all the warnings in front of us.
We need someone else to help us.
Yeah, it's kind of like we do. Amazing. I
think we do. I think that's interesting that there's these 4 horsemen, and then you go to so there's these 6 kind of movements in chapter 6 where there's the first 4 horsemen, and then you see the people under the altar kind of saying, "How long, O Lord?" And one thing that really stood out to me when we were studying this past week is that 6th kind of movement where people are, and you didn't talk about it this weekend. So.
Go ahead, talk about it.
Okay.
What happens?
It's this, oh man. So they're under the altar, but then there's people. It says, then the kings of the earth and the eminent people.
Oh, I like this part.
Yeah, and the commanders and the wealthy and the strong, every slave and free person hid themselves in the caves among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us, hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? And love is kind of not an appropriate word, but I find it really compelling that it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you're slave or free, that everyone collectively who is unrepentant, they're all finding themselves in the same place, hiding under these mountains, asking for them to fall on them so they don't have to truly be seen.
Yeah, so I actually did read that section in the 11:30 service only. It's fascinating. So I did in a few of the services. I asked the question of people, how many people repent throughout the entirety of Revelation, and the answer is 0. No one does. In spite of all that's happening, everything that's going on, no one falls to their knees and says, "This is because of us. We're doing this. Let's repent." No one leads that charge. And in fact, worse, well, in Revelation 9, we find they keep doing what they've been doing. They don't stop. But here, it's this hiding. It's this avoidance. It's this just fall on us. And I love it, like who can stand, almost putting it back on on God. Like, you're just too much. It's too much. This isn't our fault. This is your fault. You're too hard. You're too harsh. It's not us. And so they refuse to face themselves. They refuse to be seen. And they do exactly what Adam and Eve did. They go and they hide. And it's a sobering picture of humanity, because I think we'd like to think that when confronted with reality, we would change. And I think we're far less likely to do that than we think.
Yeah.
And that's frightening. That's frightening. We always give ourselves the benefit of the doubt. Well, if I was living in Nazi Germany, I wouldn't have been a Nazi. Yeah. Yeah, right.
I think it's those people that are willing to face themselves, that ultimately find that when they're really honest about what they're capable of, when they're really honest about their capacity for sin, they can run to Jesus and find the endurance that they wouldn't otherwise have if they had tried to do it on their own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a humility that's lacking.
Yeah. So if you want to endure, you have to first admit that you can't.
Yeah, true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
So true. That's really good.
Yeah. I think also the idea that there's these people like hidden and tucked under the altar, and then there's these people
under rocks and mountains and caves. Yeah.
Yeah. I just like the idea of a phrase like, you either hide from him or you hide in him.
That's so true.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's really good. You should preach this weekend. Talk. That's the best. Talk about that.
Yeah. Is just that reality that the safest place you could be is in Christ.
Yeah.
And and the safest place from even from yourself, from any kind of outside kind of threat that might come at you. It's this idea of being kept. I pray that you would keep them from the evil one. I don't pray that you would take them out. And I don't know, just the idea of Christ in us and Christ all around us. And if we caught a glimpse of the unity that we have just in him through the Spirit, then we would be a people unstoppable. So, yeah. Anyway, it's interesting.
Good.
Yeah,
Good.
I know. Well, it's fun. And then we didn't get into 7 very much, but when you think about this idea of who can stand, you see a lot of people.
Yeah, you do.
Standing.
Who can? So, and there are people that do. But it depends on who they're sealed by, who they belong to. That'll be a real theme of the whole book. Yeah,
it will be. And then we'll get into that a little bit more later. Revelation 8, you talked about, let's talk about the censer. Okay.
Come on.
So I have Eugene Peterson's book. It's called Reversed Thunder.
Yeah.
And it's based on this George Hubert poem. I want to say it's from the 17th century. Of
course it is.
But I know.
Leave it to Eugene Peterson to name his book after a line from a 17th century poem.
I know. Nietzsche?
Really?
For A Long Obedience in the same direction as the Nietzsche line.
Yeah.
And then,
he's
George.
Amazing.
He is, So... but the idea of reversed...
Not Nietzsche, Peterson. I mean,
yes, let's
Nietzsche's
be clear.
a pretty brilliant thinker, but,
he was.
but also, I'm talking about Peterson.
But he named it Reversed Thunder because he talked about Revelation being this book that sparks the praying imagination. And Reversed Thunder, is the prayers of the saints rising from the earth.
Huh.
Isn't that cool?
That is cool. I wondered, I've seen you with that book, and I've wondered what he's referring to with Reversed Thunder.
Yeah. It's pretty cool. But let's
beautiful.
talk about this idea of the censer. And so if we see 6, it is this judgment kind of starting to churn. But I also see it as almost like this. There's still a warning. You would think there's maybe still a little bit of things are really, really bad, but they're gonna get worse. And there's the cyclical nature of the seals, and then the trumpets, and then the bowls, and this quickening. And so you have 6, and then you have 7 where there's almost like this interlude. And then you have 8. And 3 through 6, is that where it is? Yeah. Another angel came and stood at the altar holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him so that he might add it to the prayers of the saints on the golden altar, which was before the throne. And then verse 5 says this, then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and hurled it to the earth. And there were peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. And I remember Dr. Vlachos saying that this is a warning from heaven. And I can't, when I think about the peals of thunder around the throne and peals of thunder hurled down to the earth, like this is, heaven is coming down. And there is going to be this clash.
Yeah. That eventually happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And it looks like judgment. So anyway, say more words.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I thought, when we initially started looking at 6, 7, and 8, the part that was hard for me was thinking about, and it depends on your eschatology and whether or not you think we'll be here for this. Depending on who you are and what you think about things, you may think that we won't be, but then it's Revelation just doesn't seem to say. And so I found myself wondering, what does it look like to if I or my children are going to live through this period faithfully? What would I tell my kids? How would I say, here's how what do you do? I mean, this is not like exactly a rosy, exciting image of a beautiful future. That's coming, but this ain't it. It's tough. And I remember just thinking to myself, man, this is so heavy. How do I talk about this? How do I give anyone any encouragement through these chapters? What can I say? And we came to these verses here, where the prayers of the saints the martyred saints from chapter 6 are now being answered in chapter 8. And I think the part that encouraged me the most was that bowl filled with incense, which are the prayers of the saints, are being brought forward. And I don't know that I said this on Saturday night, but it's interesting how, Barclay believes that verse 2 of chapter 8 is in the wrong place, that it should be later. It's probably he thinks it's like a scribal error, essentially. He thinks it should be later because it's referencing the trumpets. It would make more sense, in his view, if it read, and I'm hesitant to say things like that, but basically when the seventh seal was broken or open, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour, and the angel comes forward. I read it that way on Sunday on purpose because I wanted... So the thing that I wonder, and basically what he says is that maybe there's silence. Maybe the picture of silence is so that God can hear the prayers of the saints. Not that God needs silence to be able to hear, but it's a nice picture to say, hey, everyone, be quiet. I want to hear these prayers. They're so sacred. They're being offered up now. And so this angel comes forward with these prayers, and the powerful thought when I was thinking about what encouragement would I offer my kids? What would I tell? Yeah, how do I think about this? I mean, these are scary chapters. What do I say? And the thought was, put your prayers in that bowl. Like you can, when you pray and you go before God, those prayers don't just disappear into the atmosphere, but that they are kept, treasured, held, and one day they'll be brought forward, even though, and I have to wonder, like, how many people have prayed and felt like God didn't answer. Lord, heal my husband. I got a note yesterday from a wife or a widow whose husband has recently passed away from cancer. And I prayed with him just a few weeks ago, and sadly he's passed. And, it was a really nice note thanking us and thanking me for just, the role of the church and how helpful and supportive and all of that. But you think about like the prayer and she describes the faith journey that it was to walk through all of that. And And I think she's still on that faith journey. It's not over just because Steve died. It's you're still walking that out, because those prayers that we prayed, I think we think, well, they didn't get answered. But they will. They will. One day bodily he'll be raised up, like he will be healed. Cancer will be annihilated. Death will be annihilated. Like at the end, all of it gets wiped away. And life, love, goodness will rule. And that will be the nature of life going forward. And I think like that's the confidence, the faith, because I mean, eventually everybody dies. Like this side of the events of Revelation, we're all, even if Steve is healed, he's eventually going to turn around and die at some point. Lazarus was raised, but then died. And so death itself and the things that we're dealing with now are temporary. And I think the confidence is that one day God will hear those prayers fully and respond. But the message that we're getting right now is a little while longer, but stay faithful. Don't give up. Don't let go of that promise. Don't really. And I think so what that does for me is gives me the confidence to face, to face the worst that life can throw at me. And it doesn't mean I'm not scared. It doesn't mean I don't feel any anxiety around any of that. It's still a walk of faith. You'd be walking that out. I mean, I prayed with another family this weekend who's in the middle of it right now. And it's just like, I mean, I can feel it. Like the tension, the uncertainty, all the imaginations that go on in your mind of what could be. And it's a battle. But I think the confidence that we have is that whether now or later, those prayers are heard and God responds, and justice comes and judgment comes. And that judgment is like you were saying, kind of a removal of what needs to go. Like when you're renovating a house, you have to tear out the wood rot. You have to get rid of those things have to go. And God will deal with the evil, the brokenness of this world. Anyway.
Yeah, the destructive nature of sin has to be removed.
Has to be.
Yeah, we can't leave it if God's gonna do a new heaven and a new earth kind of project.
Yeah. We can't just paint over it. It has to be removed.
No, and it gets messy.
Yeah,
it's really, really messy.
But I think the promises that will be kept. I mean, here they are under the altar. They're close to the Lord. They're kept through all of this. And though we may, in this case, they lose their lives, it doesn't mean they've not been kept. Yeah. They're still there. Yeah. And God deals with it in the end.
Yeah.
That's the walk of faith, I guess.
I know. I am thinking about as you're talking, and this is one thing that brought a lot of comfort to me as we were thinking, and primarily you were wrestling with this content this week, is that there is this one day element to heaven and earth being brought together and us dwelling with God forever. And yet he is also present with us right in the middle of these situations, empowering us and sustaining us and giving us the ability to endure. Yep. It is that fourth man in a fire. He hasn't left us alone. He hasn't said, okay, let's see how you guys do. Yeah. I hope you do okay. Right. I hope, me dangling this carrot of eternity in front of your face is enough for you. But he gives us real power here and now in the middle of really, really hard things. Yeah. And it's just being aware of his presence that sometimes we forget. And I find myself when I'm praying for people who are going through, heartbreaking situations, a cancer diagnosis, a family like just being ripped apart. what is going to bring them comfort more than Jesus being in the middle of that situation when you're putting your kids to bed at night and your husband's not there.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. So anyway, just this is hard stuff, but it is the stuff of faith and life and just doing this thing on a daily basis.
You know what I love about Revelation is that it doesn't flinch at those kinds of things, and neither does the rest of the Bible. It doesn't sugarcoat. It doesn't act like, well, if you'll just give your life to Jesus, all of that will go away, and you won't have to deal with any of that. Those promises is there help? Yes. Are there miracles? Yes. Is there healing? Yes. Like those are not things that we let go of, but also there's tough days. And just as we celebrate the healings that we see or God showing up in someone's life in a miraculous way, there's also stories over here of people walking through real hardship that are what we don't want to do is say, well, God was present over here, but totally absent over here because you didn't see what you were looking for in this lifetime. And I think there's a lot of people who would tell you that they've experienced the presence of God, maybe profoundly, in the midst of deep difficulty and pain.
For sure.
And He's present in both situations.
Yeah. Okay. So if we are thinking about Revelation 6, 7, and 8, and Revelation is a book to be obeyed, what does obedience look like for us?
Yeah, I think obedience looks like a couple things. When it comes to judgment, I think, and I did a better job of getting into this on Sunday, was that God's mercy, just as God is merciful to us collectively as a people, God's been merciful to you as an individual, me too. But that mercy, while His mercy far outpaces, or you could say, there is greater than overwhelms His judgment still comes. And so I think for those who continually turn their backs to His mercy, I think it's a warning to turn around and repent, to not be like the people of Revelation 6 who hide themselves from the Lord, but to allow yourself to be seen and turn and repent and say, I can't do this. To surrender is essentially, it's like, I think the image is like He's chasing you down and to turn around and just say, I surrender.
Yeah.
I surrender.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably a better version of the idea of what it means to be saved than it is us chasing the Lord. It's Him pursuing us and us finally turn around and stop running and say, okay, here I am, have me. So I think that is an invitation to repentance. Secondly, I think the thing about obedience is endurance and just a commitment that I will not let go. There's so much throughout the Gospels you see people commended for their faith, and their faith shows up often as this like dogged determination to not release, to not let go of God, like Jacob wrestling with that angel who turns out to be the Lord. I won't let go of you until you bless me. And I think that that's what you see, by the way, with the saints under the altar, is they're questioning God like Job, but they're still faithfully committed to God. Though He slay me, yet will I trust Him.
They're having the conversation with God.
Yeah.
Rather than complaining about Him, they're bringing their lament to Him.
Yeah.
And they're not stopping. So.
Yeah, and so I think it's that faithful confidence that in the face of, and this is like, so when we look forward into the future, what awaits us? I don't know. I really don't know. I hope that it's good. I mean, I think ultimately it is good, but I can't promise us what's going to happen in the next, 15, 20 years. Like I'm not here to make those kind of prognostications, I guess, if that's a word. But
it is today.
It is today. Sure. But I think the call is to faithfulness to the Lord in spite of what comes, is that I will walk through this. It is that wedding vow kind of thing, for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health. I'm with you. I remain committed to you. And I think that's and I think the great promise that we have is that in the end, what the reward of that faithfulness, I think, is so much greater than what we can possibly imagine. That's why I ended with the C.S. Lewis quote, that I love that line, that heaven, once attained, will work backwards and turn even our agony into glory.